Thank you for joining us again. Let me just tell you, if you're watching on Sunday, I do host a Zoom discussion meeting at 4 p.m. Central Time on Sundays. And if you would like to join in that conversation, just send me an email and I'll let you know what the link is to take part in that. Guys, I grew up in a very middle class, maybe even lower middle class home. So for me, things like country clubs and private dinner clubs were things that I'd heard of. I knew they existed, but I frankly had no idea what happened there or why being a member seemed to be so important to so many people. But when I became a minister, the social invitations did start to involve trips to country clubs and even much more exclusive clubs. I was still in my 20s when an elderly gentleman in the church asked me to join him for lunch in a gentleman's club. I still have the souvenir shot glass from that visit. Now, it was not a gentleman's club in the sense of the way the term is used around here. There were no naked women dancing on poles. It was really supposed to be a club exclusively for gentlemen. And though it was very nicely appointed with big leather recliners, a library, a cigar room, a billiards room, still it was in many ways more obscene than the kind of men's clubs that we have around here, the more sexy kind. It wasn't simply that you had to be a man to be a member, but more specifically, you had to be a white man. And more specifically still, you had to be a white man who was not Jewish. The waiters were all black men, neatly dressed in uniforms that were reminiscent of Pullman porters. I was horrified and couldn't wait to get out of there, but my two hosts, who were two active members of my church in Louisville, Kentucky, obviously didn't see this place as being racist at all. The anti-Semitism didn't occur to them. The misogyny didn't occur to them. It undoubtedly, indisputably was a racist, misogynist institution. And yet, these two guys, these were good guys. If they were still alive, they would be shocked to hear that I thought that the Pendennis Club was a racist, anti-Semitic, misogynist place. They just thought of it as a very nice, comfortable place where gentlemen could sit around and not be bothered by the conversation of either women or Jews. And I don't want you to think that they were moral monsters, because they really weren't. They were kind, generous, friendly guys who were totally blind to the humiliation that our black waiters were being subjected to, or what it meant that women and Jews were not allowed in the building. Such prejudices, until they are challenged, are almost always invisible. You grow up with these social barriers, and you're blind to them until you are forced to see them. And hopefully, once you see them, you will never tolerate it again. I was only 11 years old when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by a man in Memphis, Tennessee, a man who, unfortunately, I share a last name with, which earned me a good deal of unsolicited attention in my public school in rural Kentucky. My history teacher literally congratulated me in front of our entire class that had only been integrated the year before. I am certain, because I grew up with these people, that my history teacher would have been deeply offended if anyone had suggested that he was a racist. He would have said that he did not dislike black people, but Martin Luther King Jr. was disturbing the social order. In those days, white people didn't think they were being oppressive or discriminatory. Many of them just thought that white people had their places in society and black people had others. They had their own barber, they had their own restaurant, their own neighborhoods. You could say that what King was doing in the 1960s was forcing people to see what had been invisible to them. And they did not like what they were getting to see. Of course, when our nation was founded, slavery was a big part of the labor market. Many of our founding fathers were ideologically opposed to slavery. That is, they thought you shouldn't own slaves. They did not feel like they were bad slave owners. Several generously made provisions in their wills that their slaves would be liberated when they couldn't profit from them anymore, but not 1 minute sooner. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, who's credited with being the author of the Declaration of Independence, owned more slaves than any of our other founders. He had more than 600 slaves on his property. And yet he wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." He was quoting John Locke, who said life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, but Jefferson didn't really believe that everybody should have property. But he continues, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That is, everyone is equal, and government is instituted to make sure that they stay equal, and that government only has a right to have any authority over you if you grant it to them. That governments derive their authority from the will of the governed. But at the time that our country was founded, only 6% of the population could even vote. Only white men who owned property were allowed to vote. And yet it was in his mind through the ballot that they were giving consent to be governed. Thomas Jefferson intellectually acknowledged that we are all equal, but his singular vote spoke for more than 600 people who were not consulted. There were writers and social philosophers around before the founding of the nation who advocated for equality among men and women, blacks and whites, Mexicans, Native Americans, and Asians, but for the most part, those writers were largely ignored. It wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that freed slaves and women realized that they were both fighting to be recognized as full citizens, and they even tried to work together for a while. That coalition didn't hang together very well, but they tried to liberate each other. As we were expanding in the middle of the 19th century, taking over more and more territory from Mexico, the people who were living there when we stole their land were not made citizens. They weren't allowed to vote. After the Civil War, black men were recognized as citizens, although their actual access to voting was very limited. In 1876, and this is going to give you a headache, just the paradox of it is just almost more than your skull can contain, but the Supreme Court ruled in 1876 that Native Americans, Indians, were not citizens of the country we stole from them and couldn't vote. A few years after that, after the transcontinental railroad system had been built largely with Asian slaves who were not thought of as slaves at that time, the Congress declared that Asians could not become citizens of the United States. We were desperate for soldiers when it came time to fight World War I, and so a provision was made at that time if Native Americans would sever their ties with their tribe and serve in the military, that they could apply to become citizens on the continent that they had inhabited for 9,000 years. In 1920, just 1920, 100 years ago, women gained the right to vote. But it wasn't until 1950s that Native Americans and Latinos and Asians were able to gain full citizenship, and still most of them were intimidated out of either registering to vote or voting. There were literacy tests, there were poll taxes, and there were none too subtle threats of violence. When James Madison sat down to pen the first draft of our Constitution, he begins with this soaring language. The first three words, we the people. We the people, not kings, not monarchs, not some feudal incest between the church and the state. We the people. But Madison was not thinking of the more than 100 slaves back on his Virginia plantation. And it would be nearly 200 years before we the people would include women and blacks and Asians and Latinos and Native Americans. I think that the peculiar genius of Martin Luther King Jr. was his awareness that the lack of rights among black people was nearly invisible to almost all white people. But by the mid-1960s, the new invention of the television had found its way into almost everyone's home. And news stations then had portable cameras that they could take out to report on news as it happened in the streets. And that was a really new innovation. And Martin Luther King realized that if only white people were forced to see what had been invisible to them, they wouldn't be able to stand it. Now, King and other civil rights leaders had multiple meetings in the White House with President Kennedy and then President Johnson, and they oftentimes gained their sympathy, but they felt like it was politically impossible to do anything about their plight. Black men had legally been allowed to vote since 1870, but most southern states made it virtually impossible, so that the black vote was almost no impact whatsoever. So King realized that by staging demonstrations in which participants had for days been trained, I think this is one of the greatest weaknesses of the demonstrations that we do today, we don't have any training. We don't have any shared ideology. But King would go and meet with the leaders for days prior to a demonstration, and everyone had to sign a pledge that they would not strike back, that if they were struck, they wouldn't hit back, they wouldn't resist. And so people were beaten with police clubs. They had German Shepherd dogs set loose on them. They were trampled by police horses, but they didn't fight back. And if they could get that on camera, white uniformed police officers abusing black people who were simply trying to register to vote, then that would put President Johnson in a position where he really couldn't say no to passing a Voters' Rights Act. The march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama took place in March of 1965, and the TV cameras were there. That was when the late John Lewis literally had his skull broken by a police club. But the events of Bloody Sunday were broadcast into the living rooms of white America, and white America couldn't stand what they saw. Now, it didn't end racism in the South. It didn't even end voter suppression. But just 5 months later, King was standing in the White House witnessing Lyndon Johnson signing the Voters' Rights Act on August 6th of 1965. It wasn't the end of segregation, as I said. Racism went on, but it was a step in the direction of progress that really, I think it was unequaled by anything since the Emancipation Proclamation. And it happened because white America had for a moment been shown what they otherwise tried very hard not to see. I want to show you something. This is a little wooden bell that a friend gave to me. It's a wooden bell doesn't make much sense. Can't make a lot of noise. You couldn't call the kids in for dinner with the sound of a wooden bell. But this is This is a bell that's made to illustrate an old proverb from Haiti. It says, "No one listens to the cry of the poor or the sound of a wooden bell." I suspect it was a proverb that evolved out of resignation and desperation. The poor and oppressed of every nation become invisible. You cannot hear the cries of their suffering. They live in neighborhoods where there are no nice stores. There are no attractive restaurants or bars. There are no lovely streets with carefully manicured lawns. So people who are not poor don't go to those neighborhoods. They don't know anyone who lives there. And frankly, they don't feel safe if they do go there. Did you know that poverty causes crime? That when salaries and employment levels go up, crime goes down? It isn't magic. It's just how it happens. I've tried for years to point out to my Catholic friends that are strong anti-abortion advocates that what causes abortion in America is typically not the Roe v. Wade decision, it's poverty. During the dot-com boom in the mid-1990s, when salaries were going up and unemployment was going down, the abortion rate fell by 50%, and it was hardly even commented on because most women would not get an abortion if they felt like they could economically keep their child. Poverty causes crime, poverty causes abortions, and what is more, the violence and stress of poverty often creates the drug trade and alcohol abuse, which leads to domestic violence, and all of that makes poor neighborhoods feel unsafe, right? The stress of living in a violent neighborhood causes mental health issues, depression, despondence, dependence on substances, and literally dependence on charity. When you hear people talking about defunding the police, most of us have no desire to do away with the police entirely. Some people do, but most of us, when we talk about defunding the police, what we're saying is that we want to reallocate that huge budget to focus on raising the standard of living of the poor. Because if you take poverty out of the equation, then you don't have nearly as much crime and you don't need as many armed police on the street. You don't have as much addiction, you don't have as much violence, you don't even have as much mental illness. Look, Joe Biden just this week announced his list of things that he wanted to do to help America get past this pandemic. And on his wish list is raising the minimum wage from coast to coast to $15 an hour. I've been demonstrating and protesting for that for years, but sometimes a crisis is what it takes to make a change that we should have made a long time ago. But I want to make a prediction right now, and hold me to it. Write this down. Hold me to it. If Biden gets that through the Senate and we actually start paying everyone at least $15 an hour, you will see within 6 months a dramatic reduction in crime. There will be fewer arrests. The population in our county jails will be cut in half. The demand for addiction treatment and mental health services will go down. And in fact, my Catholic and evangelical brothers and sisters, you will see a rapid reduction in the abortion rate. And those figures would only continue to go down more if we reallocated police funding to things like safe housing and more social workers, addiction treatment, and vocational training where people could get a job that would be better than $15 an hour. Check me, please, because I already know that I'm right about this. I just want to hear you say it. It's the little things, that makes life worth living. Yes, I'm certain that it was resignation that inspired this saying that no one hears the cry of the poor and no one listens to the sound of a wooden bell. But I want us to hear it not as a proverb of resignation, but as a challenge. It doesn't have to be the last word. We remember Martin Luther King Jr. this weekend, but please, please, please don't let it be a history lesson. Don't just memorize the wonderful things that he said and the great things that he did. The purpose of this holiday is to inspire you to do what he did. In the 1960s, he was able to amplify the cry of the poor so that we all had to hear it. He got the plight of Black America on TV and made us see it, and see it from places where we don't normally go. But in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voters' Rights Act that he had worked so hard to get passed, saying that it had accomplished its mission. Chief Justice John Roberts said, "It worked, and because it worked, we don't need it anymore." A stunning 5-4 decision that will haunt Justice Roberts' legacy. But as Ruth Bader Ginsburg predicted at the time, within 24 hours of the decision, literally the next day, the Texas legislature was missing to demand government-issued IDs to be able to vote. And you know what counts as a government-issued ID? Not student university IDs that have their picture on them that are issued by the state, but conceal and carry licenses. That counts. Because Texas Republicans know that gun owners tend to vote for their candidates and college students usually don't. For 50 years, any change to voting districts or voting regulations had to be approved at the federal level. But as soon as they gutted the Voters' Rights Act, Texas, then Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas shamelessly started to reconfigure their laws and districts to minimize the number of minority votes that would actually have any impact on an election. Georgia's governor, Brian Kemp, has lately been in the news quite a bit because Donald Trump really was angry at him because he refused to throw out the votes of black voters in the Atlanta area that could have swung the state of Georgia to him. Trump was beside himself because even though they had recounted the votes so many times that I think Biden might actually be our 48th president rather than our 46th, but it happened because Kemp refused to steal the election for Trump. But if you look back to 2018, when Kemp was the Secretary of State in Georgia, and he was the Secretary of State while he was running for governor against Stacey Abrams. Shameless. It has never been seen before in America that the person who is running the election is a candidate himself. A white man running against an amazing black woman. And so Kemp purged 53,000 voters because their signatures didn't match up between their registration and the ballots. They closed voter locations in minority neighborhoods. They shortened the early voting window. And for a host of other reasons, by the time that election took place in November of 2018, Kemp had purged more than 1.4 million voters from the rolls in Georgia. Now, when the election happened, Kemp won by 50,000 votes. He had purged 1.4 million. So his winning margin was just 4% of the black people that he had taken voting rights away from. So why wouldn't Trump think that Kemp would steal the 2020 election? He had stolen the 2018 election for himself. And that may seem like something incendiary for a corpulent cleric to say, but if you'd been listening to the cry of the poor in Georgia in 2018, you would know that I'm right. 147 Republican members of Congress and the Senate voted 2 weeks ago against confirming the results of the 2020 election. 147 members of Congress and the Senate. What they specifically were wanting to do was to discard votes that had been cast in majority black cities, Atlanta, Detroit specifically. Many of the people in the January 6th riot in the Capitol really believed that Trump had won the election, but underlying that belief was the belief that black people shouldn't have been voting in the first place. I know that's strong, but why else do you think they were carrying the Confederate battle flag through the Capitol building? One person that the police actually wrestled to the ground to arrest complained, "You're treating me like a black man." The privilege runs that deep. Race is at the root of Donald Trump's complaint. Race is at the heart of the pro-Trump terrorists, and race is at the root of voter suppression. Martin Luther King Jr. found a way to amplify the voices of the poor in 1965. In 2021, folks, we don't need to keep marching over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That's been done. But if you want to honor King's memory, the way to do it is to find a way to amplify the voice of the poor today, so that the white people in Georgia will know that Stacey Abrams really ought to be their governor, and when they have a chance to vote again in 2022, they need to get it right. This is what it means to be a prophetic witness in 2021. This is what it means to be a progressive Christian, a progressive Jew, a progressive Muslim, or Buddhist in 2021. It's up to us to help the world see the poor and to hear their cry and to make sure that no matter how tricky or slick racism becomes in the 21st century, we have to keep shining a light on gerrymandering and on closing polls in minority areas and making it where they can't take buses of voters from Sunday services in black churches to the polls to vote. Because speaking the truth to power is the primary reason that progressive communities of faith exist. And if you're not doing that, if you're not speaking truth to power, if you're not elevating the voice and the plight of the poor, well then hell, enjoy your bake sale.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.